Efforts to stifle criticism often include smearing critics by accusing them of being anti-Semitic. Martin Peretz of the New Republic said that Carter, quote, will go down in history as a Jew hater. And a critic in the Washington Post said that Carter's views were similar to David Duke's. Needless to say, this is a common charge leveled at Steve and me, even though there is no evidence behind it. For instance, the Anti-Defamation League said in a press release this past November that Jew hatred lives on in speeches by Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, in writings of the professors John Mearsheimer and Stephen Wall, and in conspiracy theories about Jewish involvement in 9/11. On more than one occasion, critics have likened our book to the infamous fraud, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. However, if you read our book, you will find there's nothing anti-Semitic about it or anything remotely like the Protocols. Smearing, it should be emphasized, serves three purposes. First, it distracts people from the real issue, which is U.S. Middle East policy, and instead puts the focus on the critic. I cannot tell you how many times Steve and I have been interviewed where the first question is whether or not we are anti-Semitic or not, and then most of the subsequent discussion focuses on us instead of on the substance of our argument, which is what we really want to talk about. Second, smearing people marginalizes the critic in the public arena. After all, what politician would want to associate with someone who had been charged with being an anti-Semite? You can rest assured that neither Steve nor I will get a call anytime soon from Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. Third, it deters others from criticizing Israeli policy and the U.S.-Israeli relationship as they see what happens to those who do. And everyone noticed very well what happened to Jimmy Carter over the course of the months following the publication of his book. The bottom line here is that few, if any, politicians will say anything remotely critical of Israel, and neither will anyone who wants to be a serious player in the making of U.S. foreign policy. The result is that there is almost no serious debate about support for Israel in the United States, especially in Congress, even when it is obvious to almost everyone that U.S. Middle East policy has gone badly awry. Let me now address the important and controversial question of just how powerful the lobby is. Almost all of our critics acknowledge that there is a lobby, but they either argue that it is not very powerful, or that we are saying that it is all powerful, or that it controls U.S. Middle East policy. To be clear, we explicitly say that the lobby is not all powerful and that it does not control U.S. Middle East policy. Instead, we argue that the Israel lobby is very powerful and that it has a marked influence on American foreign policy. Indeed, when you look carefully at the evidence, there is little doubt that the Israel lobby is an especially powerful interest group, which again is perfectly legitimate in the American political context. Consider AIPAC, which is just one of the many organizations in the lobby, although surely the most powerful one. AIPAC was ranked #2 in a 2005 National Journal survey of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, and it ranked second in a 1997 survey by Fortune magazine. Bill Clinton said that AIPAC was, quote, better than anyone else lobbying in this town. And Newt Gingrich, who rarely agrees with Bill Clinton about anything, said it was, quote, the most effective general interest group across the entire planet. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton from Indiana, who served in Congress for 34 years, said, quote, there's no group that matches it. They're in a class by themselves. Former Senator Fritz Holly said as he left office that, quote, you can't have an Israel policy other than what AIPAC gives you. Stephen Rosen, The AIPAC official, who is now under indictment for passing classified information, once put a napkin in front of Jeffrey Goldberg, a journalist from the New Yorker, and said, quote, "In 24 hours, we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this napkin." And Goldberg, who wrote one of the most vicious reviews of our book, calls AIPAC, quote, "a leviathan among lobbies." Speaking of our critics, I might note that Alan Dershowitz said, I want you to keep this firmly emblazoned in your brain. This is Alan Dershowitz. "My generation of Jews became part of what is perhaps the most effective lobbying and fundraising effort in the history of democracy." That's Alan Dershowitz. Thus, it is hardly surprising that Israeli Prime Minister Olmert said just last year, "Thank God we have AIPAC, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world." And again, AIPAC is just one part of the lobby. Now we come to what's probably the most controversial issue in our book, the claim that the lobby's influence is good for neither the United States nor Israel. To make that case, I want to focus on the lobby's influence on U.S. policy toward the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. It has been the official policy of every U.S. president since 1967 to oppose the building of settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And that includes the present President Bush, who has made repeated requests to the Israelis to halt settlement building. Yet no president has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements and, in effect, colonizing those territories. Just to show you how serious this problem is, consider what the Israelis did in the occupied territories between the signing of the Oslo Peace Accords in September 1993 and the outbreak of the Second Intifada in September 2000. During that 7-year period, when the Clinton administration was committed to creating a Palestinian state and finally settling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israelis confiscated 40,000 acres of Palestinian land, built 250 miles of connector and bypass roads, doubled the number of settlers, and built 30 new settlements. President Clinton, like his predecessors and his successor, could not use America's considerable leverage to halt this building spree. In fact, the Clinton administration effectively supported Israel's actions in the occupied territories by protecting the Jewish state from criticism at the UN, giving it more foreign aid than any other country, and giving it unconditionally. Of course, the reason the Clinton administration was unable to put meaningful pressure on Israel, and the reason that other presidents, including President Bush, have been unable to put pressure on Israel to stop building settlements, is the lobby. Nevertheless, Israel's policies in the occupied territories are not in America's national interest, which is why every president since Lyndon Johnson has opposed the settlements. To be more specific, there is an abundance of survey data and anecdotal evidence which shows U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and U.S. support for Israel's efforts to colonize those territories angers, if not enrages, huge numbers of people in the Arab and Islamic world. Not surprisingly, that anger helps fuel terrorism against the United States. Let me emphasize that I'm not saying that America's support for Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is the only cause of our terrorism problem. I am simply saying it is a major cause. Specifically, it motivates some individuals to attack the United States. It serves as a powerful recruitment tool for terrorist organizations. And it generates sympathy and support for terrorists among huge numbers of people in the Arab world. To illustrate this point, consider what the 9/11 Commission says about the motives of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who it identifies as the principal architect of the 9/11 attacks. The Commission report says, quote, by his own account, KSM's animus towards the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. That's Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the principal architect of the 9/11 attack.